Hello! Magandang hapon po, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Sa ating mga kabsat ay mayap at ganap, naimbag ang malim pala sa mga kabsat at sa ating mga igsuon dyan sa Visayas. Maayong hapon, maupay nga kulop, maayong ugto. At sa ating mga kapatid sa Mindanao, Assalamualaikum. Buenas tardes. Ayan, ako, hitik na naman ang ating usapan sa hapong ito, no? At alam nyo naman itong ating regular na SDG or Sustainable Development Goals Action Hour ay nagaganap ito tuwing Biyernes ng hapon, alas 3:30 hanggang alas 5. Ito po yung mga kamustahan natin para sa maayos, mabuti, at makabuluhang kinabukasan ng bawat isa sa atin. Isang oras at kalahati ng hitik na usapan. At sa hapong ito, very exciting at interesting na naman na ating topic. At bago tayo pumunta dyan, baka po nagtataka kayo, ang atin pong kapatid na si Mark na talagang nag-MC dito ay pagpapahingahin lang po natin at siya ay medyo namamalat. Marky, hello? Okay, so sa hapong ito, sabi ko nga very exciting ang ating topic, kasi napapanahon po ito dahil alam natin na tayo ay nakaka-experience na ng climate change, di ba? Hindi lang po ito uso-uso, ha? Nararamdaman na talaga natin ang epekto nito kapag sobrang init ng panahon. Alam natin na napakaraming ulan ang bubuhos nito at ang epekto din nito sa atin, magkakasakit tayo. Hindi lang tayo, pati yung ating mga alagang hayop at lalo na yung ating mga kaibunan dyan. Kaibunan kasi po, ang pag-uusapan natin ay ang mga ibon. Birds in English, no? So, ako personally kasi, na-admire ko yung mga ibon, yung mga, lalo na iba-ibang colors yan. Pero tayo dito sa Manila, hindi natin masyadong napagtutuunan ng pansin ang mga ibon, no? Lalo na yung contribution nila sa ecology at ang naidudulot dito sa ating mga kalusugan, nakakatulong, pero alam natin nagdadala din sila ng sakit, di ba? Anyway, sa hapong ito napakapalad po natin kasi magkakaroon tayo ng mas malawak at mas malalim na kaalaman tungkol sa epekto ng pagbabago ng klima sa ating mga ibong lumilipad-lipad. Yan. Kaya po tayo sa kwento ng ating panauhin na pinamagatang Climate Impact on Birds ay magkakaroon tayo ng maraming kaalaman. Ang atin pong panauhin ay napakaswerte natin. Dalubhasa po sa usapin ng biodiversity conservation and preservation. At hindi lang po yun, masugid pa po siyang tagapagtaguyod ng mga pag-aaral patungkol sa mga ibon sa wikang Ingles. Ito po ang ornithological studies. Diba? Tama yan, siya po ay nagtapos ng kanyang kolehiyo at master's degree on wildlife biology and zoology sa University of the Philippines sa Los Baños. Ang kanya naman pong doctoral degree in zoology, special talaga, natapos niya to from St. Anne's College, University of Oxford. Oxford lang naman po, United Kingdom. At ito po ay through the scholarship ng Ford Foundation International Fellowships Program. Hindi lang po yun, ito pong ating panahuin, napaka-busy. Pero talagang he really found time para po makasama natin siya sa hapong to. Po ito, napakarami ng natanggap na awards, in recognition for his service sa wildlife preservation. Kapilang po dito sa mga awards yung Coy Memorial Award, Outstanding Alumni for Extension Service Award, UPLB Young Science Outstanding Teacher for Biological Sciences, and yung National Academy for Science and Technology Outstanding Young Scientist for Zoology. Hindi lang po yan, Outstanding UPLB Alumnus Award pa for Education and Research at marami pa pong iba. Pag binanggit ko po lahat, baka abutin tayo ng bukas. Hindi na po siya makapag-present. Anyway po, siya po ay kasalukuyang curator for birds at the Museum of Natural History of UP Los Baños and also a professor of the Institute of Biological Sciences in the same university. Wag na natin pagtagalin to. Let us all welcome at palakpakan ang ating special guest for this afternoon. Please welcome Dr. Juan Carlos Texon Gonzalez. Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Gonzalez. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ma'am Dada. Ako ang aking mother Dada nga naman. Si Ma'am po ay ang nag-alaga sa amin. Habang kami ay nag-aaral. Kung po yung nag-aaral na GPhil po sa Oxford. Si Ma'am Dada po nag-aalaga sa amin from the Philippines, of course, um, para po sa aming as scholars of the International Ford Foundation. So maganda po na it's actually siya po yung nag-contact sa akin. Of course, I did po si our national scientist Lourdes Cruz. Makakapag hindi pa naman po ako. It is an honor and a privilege to be invited to talk to this for the SDG hour po ng Future Earth Philippines. So without further ado, thank you po again for the invitation. I'll share my slide first so we can have a visual of what we're going to talk about. Just to start with, papasalamat po again for the Future Earth Philippines SDG Action Hour for this webinar. Today po is important because it is February 13th. Alam ko sa inyo po, ay naku, February 13th, Friday the 13th. But although it's a Friday, it's World Love Hornbills Day. So ako po, yan po ang thesis ko nun nung nag-aaral po ako ng aking doctorate. I studied the origin and diversification of hornbills of the world. So tama-tama po yan. Para feel ko timing talaga na inimbita po ako magsalita about birds for today. So ang topic ko po is climate impacts on birds because we often consider nga naman na tayo naapektuhan po ng a lot of these climate issues and events, extreme weather changes, but we sometimes forget that we have all these other bioindicators around us, and birds are, of course, important bioindicators. So it's important for us to look into these climate change impacts on birds. And a lot of us, because it is an archipelagic country, easily affected. So, di ba nga claim na ang Pilipinas po is well known for being one of the most affected by these climate events. Just before I talked about these climate impacts on birds, I'd like to see parang forward ko lang po yung aking connection with Future Earth Philippines. I remember attending the ACES 2019 noon sa Tawid-Tawid with academician Zanza na present na po yung Future Earth. I also presented actually a fauna conservation during a seminar workshop of Future Earth on knowledge to action programs for sustainability and resilience noon. Kasama po namin si Dr. Cruz in 2019 also sa La Union. Actually, we had thought of developing a proposal to look into using birds as indicators as well as other organisms on climate change and fitness. We started out with a proposal in 2021 kasama po namin si Dr. Marian De Leon of the Museum of Natural History, our director. But of course, we still try to look for funding for that. So eventually, hopefully we can submit that for a future study. So I think it's really important that we discussed the issue of sustainable development goals and climate impacts on the context of other species. Kasi hindi po sila makakapagsalita, tayo po ang voice for these species. And we have to protect biodiversity because biodiversity is important in maintaining ecosystem services. It helps maintain the balance of the environment. So a lot of these impacts can be affecting birds in general, from extreme super typhoons that we get, frost and heat waves, wildfire from droughts, mudslides and flooding, even disruption of natural systems and disruption of the food web. And of course, the most severe is biodiversity loss and extinction. So we can look at it a bit more close. Ano ba yung mga climate-related events na yan? So extreme weather builds to more stronger super typhoons, well, typhoons in general or storms, na di ba mas manimit na po natin narinig yung term super typhoon. So sana po ay hindi naman. But a lot of our species, especially birds, are adapted to these, especially nasa eastern side of the Philippines. I think they are, in a sense, resilient and able to adapt. But of course, as they get stronger, that adaptation is affected. There's a lot of these closed canopy forests. So hindi lang naman po tayo ang nagdi-disturb. So may natural calamities also that help reduce canopy cover and often expose a lot of the understory, especially with strong storms. I know it rebuilds and most of the vegetation recovers, but it's also yung immediate effect po for these understory species and canopy species. Extreme drought also has these potential for forest fires or wild brush fires. This is actually one that I've taken in Bayat. There's also one photo I've taken in Mindoro because yun yung mga areas na often when there's drought, nagkakaroon po ng forest fires. Because of the islands, we have an archipelagic country. Impacts on sea level rise, so SLR, especially with impacts of storm surges on small islands such as this one. This is Tubata, is one of the bird islets in Tubata Reef. You can actually see the changes nung contours nung sandbars because of changes in tides as well as sea level rise. Extreme rainfall on the other hand, so merong drought, meron naman extreme rainfall. Mention nga ni Ma'am Dada kanina yung maulan. So if they're extreme, medyo na overwhelm po yung environment, so you get mudslides and of course flooding, and that can affect either directly yung nesting areas but also feeding areas for birds. There's also these temperature changes, mga climate-related events on temperature. From a record, heat wave, lagi po tayo, top of the record. I remember last year, nagkaroon po ng frost sa Cordillera. So, hindi naman po siya extreme frost like this. This is actually a photo from Oxford, pero I wasn't able to get up to the Cordillera to get those photos of frost. But yeah, that easily affects, kasi nandito po tayo sa, the Philippines is quite different that we're in a latitude that nasa border po tayo. I mean, Taiwan gets snow and frost, pero tayo po is minimal. But that's already the latitude which allows us to, when climate events, of course, occurs, easily changes. Madali po magtopple yung temperature thermocline. So you have, if those changes also affect the cycle of not only birds but also the fruits and flowers that they are dependent on. So yung phenology of flowers and fruits and timing po ng pag-emerge ng flowers, especially if there's seasonality in their emergence. So especially affected po yung mga frugivores like this hornbill. You also have climate impacts on the phenology of invertebrates. So I think it also follows through with invertebrates, not just the ones that you see on terrestrial, but also aquatic. So yung mga emergence. So these are swarms of insects that help feed birds, especially during the breeding season. Okay, so I'll put into context some of these different groups of birds that I think are interesting on the aspect of climate change. So mangrove birds is one. Why? Because they, of course, are easily affected. As we know, we often say, importante po ang mangroves because they help protect us from storm surges. Of course, if it protects us from storm surges, also, there are birds which live in those mangroves. So there's what we call mangrove-associated species, especially in coastal mangroves. Well, I'm putting apart the waders because I'm going to discuss waders and shorebirds a bit later. But yeah, mangroves, in a sense, have these resident birds. We actually have a paper that we're preparing for that on the 20 to about 30 species of mangrove-associated birds. They're highly resilient to this disturbance. Sanay po sila dun sa tidal changes and surges. But of course, with extreme events, that easily affects most of those species. But often they're really adapted. Quite interesting. They're very adapted to changes in their ecosystem that they can even move beyond mangrove. So minsan naisip natin na yung mga species that we consider as mangrove-associated are also species that we see in orchards, plantations, and even urban areas like this collared kingfisher. So the other side of that ecosystem, we have mangroves. Yung pababa naman po dun sa mudflats are the waders and the shorebirds. So they need these coastal mudflats, those sandy seagrass beds and coralline rock, and exposed coralline rock, as you see there. Then you have these tidal changes in the bays and estuaries, especially in the mangroves. Are of course yung importante kasi tide, as you see, they're long-legged, they're waders and shorebirds. So any extremity on the tide would affect the feeding abilities of these birds. Also, they feed on inland wetlands, swamps, and intermittent floodplains, which is since affected by rainfall. And then one of my example for these waders and shorebirds are spoonbill, stilts, sandpipers, stints, snipes, plovers, egrets, herons, rails, terns, skulls. So marami po shorebirds and waterbirds that are members of the SDG 4 I think the most important one in terms of climate impact is tree cavity nesters. So mga tree cavity nesting birds. Why? Because when a typhoon occurs, marami pong bubabagsak na puno. And sometimes, konti na nga po yung puno. Ano yung percentage ng puno na may butas? And those cavities are important for nesting species like this hornbill. So meron na po namang primary cavity nesting birds. These are the woodpeckers and the barbets, which can make their own nests. But not all of them can make. So meron tinatawag na secondary cavity nesters. These are birds that make use of existing cavities or those produced by primary cavity nesters. So these are hornbills, the kingfishers, trogons, parrots, kakatu, falcons, starlings, miners, rollers, even owls. So they are dependent on the availability of these tree boles with, and of course, insufficiency of those cavities. So are there enough cavities available? So here was a study that we did in Sierra Madre. I just want to show you, kung malaki po siya na poster. But zero in on the center graph, which is green, shows you the number of large trees. So this is an ideal setup kasi maganda po sa Northern Sierra Madre Natural Park. It's really a pristine rainforest. They have large trees in the site, which is what I think is primary forest. And the number of those large trees, which about 60 centimeters, 30 to 60 centimeter diameter classes, decreases considerably in altered or in disturbed lowland forests. And also the canopy height and canopy cover is reduced. And if you think about the number of trees, you also think about the potential nesting cavities, because ano ba yung proportion of those trees that would have a cavity, and hence a cavity sufficient for use by a particular species, such as this one. So ito po yung nest cavity ni-inspect of a rufous hornbill, which is one of our largest hornbills, and of course requires a large cavity. Then you have species which we call forest canopy specialists. So hindi naman po lahat. We have one of the reasons why we have a high diversity of species is because we have a lot of ecosystem types, a lot of forest types, but also even the forest itself has stratification. So may mga species that are specialists on the top layer, and ones that live on the middle canopy, and ones that live in the understory. So this is a group that lives on the top layer. So often we consider whether that forest is closed or open, but both are still stratified lowland or even mid-montane forests. So you have the layer which is the emergent to mid-canopy, so that includes your raptors like the Philippine eagle, hornbill, swifts, parrots, pigeons, crows, even flower pickers, yung makakainis sa flower pickers. Ang liit-liit na nga, hirap na makita, tapos doon pa sa taas nakatira. And then you have the bee-eaters also, which capture all these large forest bees. So yung food source nila are in the canopy. And thus they are tolerant of exposures, nakalabas sila sa init. But of course, they still have these limitations. On the opposite side of that spectrum, you have your understory specialists, yung mga ibon na nasa baba sa ilalim. Often ito yung mga nakikita natin kasi when we study the forest, we're often on the ground. Hindi natin napapansin yung canopy kasi masyado nasa taas. It's either you climb up, there's a series of ladders, or you use a single rope technique to help climb up to the forest canopy and study the birds there. But more often than not, most of us who do research in the forest are on the ground. And we see, ito yung mas nakikita natin, yung understory specialists. They are on the understory, in the brush, and the forest floor. And that microclimate is easily shielded by the closed canopy. So the better the forest is, mas shielded siya, madilim, nice and humid. There's a lot of vegetation to hide in. And of course, their resource or the food source is near the ground. However, if you have a storm, it opens up the canopy. Most of these birds are intolerant of exposure from that high heat and also intolerant of exposure from predators, which help those brush cover actually helps them hide from predators. So a lot of these intolerant endemics are like bleeding hearts, pitas, thrushes, babblers especially, and shamas or thrushes. Then you have these birds which are we kind of designate as small island specialists. So when we're an archipelagic country, so we have a lot of these small islands, and some of these islands have sandy beach forests, so quartz mangroves, and some coastal forests which are on top of what we call karst limestone, and these offer a really good sanctuary for a lot of birds in even how small the island is, and some of them are adapted to this kind of environment. So the Nicopar pigeon, ay gusto talaga niya naman, maliliit na island. And on the top of so siya naman yung medyo nasa understory and the ground. Sa taas naman you find imperial pigeons, whether pied imperial pigeons or kamaso, and the green and spotted imperial pigeons. On sandy areas, you have the tabon scrub fowl or the tabon, which is a megapode, which does not it doesn't incubate its nest by sitting on it. Instead, they create mound nests. So they put them in sand and leaf litter, which helps, of course, create the heat and incubate their eggs in that mound. On these islands, you also find these unusual owls. On extreme ends, the elegant scops owl and Batanes and Babuyan, and Mantanani scops owls that you find across the western side of the Philippines, from Mindoro down to Tawi-Tawi. And of course, cockatoos. Cockatoos in Palawan, they roost in Rasa Island. So it's interesting that you have these important sanctuaries. Of course, they're affected by human perturbation. Ang pinakagrabe is invasive alien species like rats. That was a problem in Ursula Island and Minasawa Island. They're both bird sanctuaries, but they were ravaged by introduced rats that came in from the boats. But of course, nowadays medyo nakokontrol na daw. So hopefully, protection of the birds is assured. My favorite group of birds is the seabirds. After hornbills, seabirds are amazing birds because they have all these adaptations to survive apart from the impact of salt. So paano sila nag-excrete ng salt. And also because in small islands, they breed in these and roost in these small islands. So they need these isolated islands. So areas like Lawak Island, the islets of Tubataha Reef, Apo Reef, and of course, alongside the Sulusibe, you have these like Bangkoran, Kabili. These were small islands that used to have, or may still have, roosting and nesting of seabirds. Because they're small, they're easily impacted by storm, whether storm surges or sea level rise, as well as extreme drought and heat. Kasi wala silang source of fresh water. So the vegetation may be sparse. So that kind of yung sand actually amplifies the heat. So may natural impact na sila from nature. The nature has these disturbances, but of course they're also affected by human perturbation, introduced alien species. I remember in Cavite where we were able to see dogs, cats roaming the understory, and of course wala na makakabreed na ground nesters. So you'll have to be on the trees. Sometimes you lose these breeding sites. So we only have very few breeding sites for seabirds. Even though we have 7,600 islands, there's only a handful left. So we need to protect those islands. Okay, next would be a group of birds. On the opposite, you have the islands, but also because the Philippines is highly rugged. We're a very rugged country. Diba tawag nga is ridge to reef because from small island, from coastal areas, biglang top of the mountain, very steep. And on that we have mountains and mountain massifs which are 1,000 meters up, and that creates a new set of ecosystem, which is the montane forest. And you have these montane forest specialists. And often we don't encroach montane forests because they're quite high. So hindi masyado siya na-affected by logging and but so yung actual perturbation is quite limited. And they're often designated as core zones in protected areas. Buffer zone kasi nasa baba dati sa mga lowlands. So a lot of them are easily protected as because they're highland species. So highland or mountain. And most of them are endemic to their own mountain massifs. Like this is not Apo sunbird. It's endemic to the mountains of Mindanao. So aside from an island endemic, they have subspecies which are endemic to particular mountains. So grabe talaga yung kanilang endemism. It's quite beautiful. Of course, they can be affected by, mountains can be affected by landslides. There's extreme drought, may fire. And because of changes in temperature, the thermocline may change across those altitudinal gradients. Although at the moment, I don't think that's a major issue, but maybe in the future, we need to monitor that. And of course, that's important because birds are important as bioindicators. Okay, then you have this, medyo hindi napapansin yung bamboo and grass fish. But of course, the bamboo specialist. Meron tayo tinatawag ng mayang kawayan. Which is active. So kailan mo maya is this one? This is Maya Pula, which is actually used to be what we call the Philippine weaver and became our national bird. Of course, now with the new law, it's a Philippine eagle that's a national bird. But these are grass eaters, and of course, also feed in rice fields. But they're more attuned to feeding on wild grass. And medyo nawawala na rin kasi yung mga wild grass. So of course, they'll feed on what's available, which is rice and corn. But as long as they're natural grasslands that you can feed on, and of course, that would be something good for graminivores such as these. But there is one group, which is the bamboo. There's a unique phenology and seasonality of bamboos when they produce seed, especially in northern hills and up in mountains. So medyo limitado siya. So there's a lot of these endemic graminivores that migrate locally as flocks. So a classic example would be the green-faced parrotfinch in Bataan. So they move in certain flocks and target stands. Alam nila kung kailan magsiseed yung bamboo. But if we lose these areas of or patches of bamboo that produce the seed for a particular time, then it affects the populations of our, it's already endangered, the green-faced parrotfinch. So yeah, so of course a lot of areas are affected as we expand for agriculture, which is natural because we need food. But there are also impacts by introduced alien species like the Eurasian tree sparrow, on not just affecting the native grass but also affecting rice and corn fields, being of course a pest. Okay, one interesting habitat that we have are pine forests, and it's very much limited to a few areas in the Philippines, particularly in Cordillera Central and some Zambales Mountains. There's also some pine stands in Mindoro, but the unique stands of Pinus Quezia in Cordillera Central, extending again up to Zambales, are important habitat to a species known as the red crossbill. And there's a subspecies unique to the Philippines, the Luzon crossbill. It's one of the only two subspecies of the red crossbill that goes into tropical areas. It's easily a temperate species. Pero nga, because pine forests are in a more higher altitude, so it's a bit colder para pumapantay siya in terms of latitude, temperature up north. So I think that high altitude pine stand helps provide that habitat for the pine, and then of course provides food for the crossbill. They have these weird beaks that are specially attuned to feeding on pine seeds, open and in pine cones to get to the seeds. So what weird is, because they're pine cones, they need a bit of heat to open up the pine cones. So in a way, they are fire maintained habitats. So they, yung issue of brush fire, but in a limited limited amount, may be important in maintaining these habitats. Pero yung extreme brush fire might be too much for them. So yun naman yun. So I think it's just a balance. Okay, so apart from the different groups of birds, we look at general impact on what they feed on. So there's like the phenology of the fruits and flowers that they feed on. Many forest birds are frugivores, feed on fruit, nectivores that feed on nectar, graminivores that feed on seed, or both omnivores. They feed on as carnivores and insectivores and feed on these on both fruit, seeds, and nectar. So you have hornbills, pigeons, orioles, flower peckers, white eyes, starlings, and of course the bigger group bulbuls. And you have the nectivores, the sunbirds, and the spider hunters. So a lot of storms can impact the emergence of existing flowers and fruit for a short time, but it also affects the emergence of them in long term. So minsan nasisira yung timing ng fruiting. And if you don't have that seasonality of the fruit on that particular time, then ano yung kakainin ng mga ibon na to at that particular period. So if you have a whole year, may certain, hindi man everyday namin na namumulaklak at namumunga sila. So it has to come in batches. And so birds would fly off and find these patches of food in the forest. That's why you need a large area that accommodates all these fruit areas or batches of food. Breeding also is affected, the timing of breeding, so phenology of breeding. So extreme events can impact breeding sites directly, whether as loss of these nesting areas or nest themselves. They can be impacted directly by the limited availability of food. So, for example, for seabirds, naapektuhan yung what we call bait fish, yung availability of these small fish that can, of course, lead to unsuccessful brood. So, pwede mamatay ang kanilang chicks. So, of course, if we have lost the chicks of that particular season, then it affects the population dynamics later on. And thus, because they are important parts of the ecosystem, then that affects ecosystem linkages. What do they provide? They provide the guano that helps maintain the nutrient cycle. Okay, there's two things what you think about in terms of impacts, whether you're a bird that easily is affected by perturbation, whether you're small or a big-bodied bird. So we often think about two things, whether you're R-selected or K-selected. So R-selected birds tend to maximize population growth. It's actually supposed to be sparrows in that photo, but they produce more numerous, small, fast-maturing offspring with minimal parental investment, so they easily mabilis ang turnover. Adapted to unstable environments. They have shorter lifespan, high mortality rates among the offspring, often easily adaptive to exploit available resources because it's short term. So they can easily adapt. Okay. Classic example talagang very adapted is the goryon, or what's called mayang simbahan, or the introduced Eurasian tree sparrow. This is actually a flower pecker. It's also a small-bodied bird. Then you have the impact on large-bodied birds. Birds which are K-selected. They have longer lifespans, large body size. They develop slowly, so it takes a few years to become fully mature. Of course, they have lower reproductive rates, maybe 1 or 2 chicks or 3 at most. And often, like the Philippines, isa lang at a time. Then you have significant parental, often biparental care. So maraming investment to produce that young. And these populations often remain close to the carrying capacity and making them more competitive and vulnerable to biodiversity loss, especially extinction. Okay, one group of birds minsan hindi napapansin are the stream specialists. So they are stream river specialists. I have the indigo banded kingfisher as a photo, as a representative. Birds that specialize on riparian and lotic habitats, so creeks, rivers. Often they feed on fish or small invertebrates, just yung mga nymphs of dragonflies, mayflies, or caddisflies. So you have this like red starch and wagtails, even fishing owls that feed on riverine frogs. Of course, extreme rainfall and disturbance of the forest and logging can cause mudslides, and of course erodes the banks, easily muddies. I mean, you lose all that visibility of the fish and the food. And on the opposite end, you get drought, which then loses that availability of food. And then man comes in and adds more problems with dams, pollution, and over tourism. So easily affected because we have these kind of river species that are endemic to particular islands, and you find them nowhere else in the world. Okay, insect swarms and specialists. You have seasonality of insect emergence, such as moths and mayflies that come out in big groups. They're important for insectivorous birds. Rainfall increases the foliage growth, and you have the more caterpillars. There's a certain group of birds that kung galit po kayo sa caterpillar, marami pong ibon kumakain ng caterpillar like balcohas, trillers, cuckoos, warblers, titmice. So sila po yung surge of insectivores that help control these insects, which may be insect pests. So talaga importante yung ecosystem services nila. So these insect swarms are also fed upon, like say with bees and flies, they're fed upon by swifts and swallows. These are sweeping insectivores and saliers. Bee eaters, of course, that control bees and wasps. So maganda po talaga na may balance. Okay, you have these migration schedules that easily affecting migratory birds. So there's seasonal migration. They often follow that annual cycle. Change in seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall. The movement's timed often half of the year. So they come here to the Philippines when it's winter in the north. The visitors arrive in October and they leave in March when it's spring, and they're back to breed in the northern hemisphere. So changes in temperature, climate may affect schedules, can cause delays in migration. Sometimes merong temporal confusion across the use of these routes and flyways. So I don't think there's a major change, but we don't know what that means. We don't have much studies, I think, but we're now using a lot of these telemetry to help understand movements. One story, which is not the Philippines, but quite related to us, is Hawaii. And I feel bad for it because they lost a lot of their endemic species due to avian malaria. I don't know if it's the species that they brought in, like bato-bato and Mayang Paking and Mayang Koso came from the Philippines, but they were brought in to Hawaii as introduced species. And of course, along with the introduced birds came mosquitoes, which a bit odd because there's a great story of endemic birds in Hawaii. These what we call finches and specialized Hawaiian finches that evolved without avian malaria. And because they succumbed easily to the impacts of malaria, they went extinct. So the settlers that came into Hawaii brought with them some of the birds as well as the mosquitoes. And these non-native birds had malaria and they were proved fatal to the local birds. So, however, ito pa nagsasurvive because they're found in mountains. Mosquitoes require more tropical environment. So pag malamig na sa taas. So medyo nalilimit pa sila by the thermocline. So they're limited by altitude and temperature. But of course, climate change affects that thermocline and they go up higher and higher. If it heats up, then it affect more. Lumiliit na ngayon yung habitat dun sa mountain peaks. So it's just one story. It's interesting that affects one island in itself or a group of islands easily to lose to extinction. So now we need to know what we know so far. So there's that impact on nature's calendar for migration routes. These are of course, Wimbrel from Siargao and the mangroves, and they make use of roost and they winter in the Philippines. So their schedule can be affected. One timing that we know is si tarat. Ang opening is ang tarat bao. Because the brown shrike or the tarat o pakiskis is an important biological clock for farmers, especially in Laguna. So pag dumating na yung tarat, alam na natin na importante na po siya for the rice field because the migration from the north arrives in October. It's time for the rice planting season. It's also with the wet season. It's kind of the poster child or representative from a lot of migratory birds. We know that it's a migratory season once you hear a tarat singing outside. So that's the arrival of wintering birds. And of course, when pag hindi mo na sila narinig, hindi mo na sila nakita, spring na. So that means they're leaving in March. Locally, in the forest, we have hornbills. And hornbills are important to me because it's part of my thesis. They are considered a daily clock in forested mountains, and hence the name Reloj del Monte, or Clock of the Mountains. They depend on large seeded native fruit trees, which are seasonal. So that means they move across the forest seasonally looking for these important hornbill dispersed fruits like canarium, nutmegs, and aglaya. But they're also dependent on small fruits like balite. So they feed on figs, but figs are not really that seasonal. They're more asynchronous and can be found at any time of the year. So siguro para ito yung kanin nila yung staple for a lot of other birds as well, not just hornbills. And then they depend on the large seeded fruits, which are, of course, important for forest restoration, because large seeded fruits are difficult to disperse because you need large birds to disperse them. So, yan minsan yung mga importante, yung duguan or nutmeg. So, yeah, they may be affected by certain timing and emergence of this fruit. Those are the important temporal bioindicators, just like the migratory birds. So among the migratory birds, I think raptors are very interesting to be considered as temporal bioindicators because they are these amazing movements. Also, they provide important ecosystem services. They are raptorial. They'll feed on rats and sparrows, and so pigeons. So there's increased interest nowadays, what you call raptor counts. Shout out to my friends and do those the raptor counts. It's nice that we have these movements across the migratory flyways in the Philippines. They usually establish these counts in either early or late in the winter season, and often around bottlenecks where nakikita mo sila, there's a lot of movement. It's amazing if you look up in the sky, may tuldok-tuldok na ang dami palang lumilipad na hawks and goshawks and kites. So it's quite interesting, and buzzards. So if you go to northern Luzon, Batanes, Babuena, also areas in mountaintops, even here in Makiling, you'll see the movements of these migratory raptors. So what do we know so far? I think it's important we consider, because we are an archipelagic country with a lot of mountains, with a lot of ecosystem, other forest types, and a lot of different habitats, and how do we measure climate impacts, not just for those habitats, but also the organisms that are dependent on it, especially the birds. So birds are, again, important biological indicators, and we can use them as a measuring tool. If there's a diversity, density, breeding, success, it's important to tell if there's something wrong. So we often thought that we may use fitness as a measure. Ito yung pumasok yung aming proposal, that we wanted to do something about understanding the impacts of climate events or climate change, whether it's extreme or limited change. We can use birds' fitness as a measure of these impacts, their survivability, their resilience and adaptability to climate change events, and even impacts on breeding success. Of course, you need a big data set and a big to monitor that, and knowing nest boxes and things like that. But I think we can do that in a tropical context of the Philippines. So we tried to build up a proposal with the Museum of Natural History at the time to measure stress in forest birds based on parasite load and the frequency. We use that as a proxy to measure the impacts of stress, calculate stress and fitness using, say, ectoparasites as well as blood parasites or hemoparasites like Plasmodium that causes the avian malaria, or leukocytozoon, because they have different, these hemoparasites also have different vectors. And it's to be aided by techniques in microscopy or even the use of molecular techniques, which are PCR based. Okay, so how do we measure that? We needed to look into bird communities in general, diversity decline, presumably a decline due to habitat loss and change. So, for example, forest fire, yan, malaking na ravage, maraming bagsak talaga yung population and yung diversity. May storm na malaking dumaan. So, okay, so is there enough resilience for birds to natural calamities? I think they have adaptations to, because they evolved having this in mind. So talagang naturally nag-occur yung natural calamities. But it's the human disturbance added to it that I think, and the conversion of those habitats that adds into the issue of adaptability. So they can adapt to, and they're resilient to natural changes, but if dadagdag mo pa yung human disturbance, then I think that topples it up. So are they able to recover after some time for these climate impacts, which are elevated by mass? So we need to measure that. Population decline. So you have loss of breeding sites from storm surges, or if you have tree nesting birds like here in the photo, these are Worcester's black nonnies. They're a subspecies unique only to the Sulawesi. There are also another group of birds called the red-footed boobies, which also breed on nest sites, on trees. So they're tree nesting seabirds. So pag nawala yung trees, wala yung nesting areas. So that affects their population. On the other hand, you have island erosion and sea level rise, which affect those nesting on the ground, so the ground nesters. And easily, all extreme habitat loss, of course, drives all those flocks away, and you lose an entire population on that island. You have these disjunctive divisions of species which are migratory. Interesting accounts of birds are limited to certain migration locations, like Indigenous leaf warbler, which breeds in Japan and winters in Luzon. We don't know where they go. There's records only in Bataan. So we need to know where these migratories find life, survive in the Philippines, like the street reed warbler, Chinese crested tern. But nowadays we have more data with black-faced spoonbill. And because of that, we have these migratory changes. Climate change impacts migration that may lead to misaligned routes, especially flyways for the East Asian Australia flyway or otherwise other flyways, leading to a lot more accidentals and extra limital records, like this one where they overshoot. So dapat they migrate into Japan, nag-overshoot sila, these hooded cranes came into Siargao. So meron mga records na ganun which are unusual. So it may also have changes for wintering species that may either over summer or may overwinter. So rather than leaving the country, they stay. And now we have increased number of vagrants. The storms during winter. Yan, kakatawa kasi the bird watchers, uy, pag may bagyo, maraming vagrants. So this winter migratories can lead to confusion, and you have these refugees coming in from other areas which are not supposed to be in the Philippines. So vagrants and accidental visitors, not part of their known flyway or route. And they, of course, their records are new country records. And some of them are limited notes, or we call them rarities. So meron pong records ng Rhinex Batanes. Of course, nag-viral po yung story ng pelicans, like Dalmatian pelicans in Central Visayas. You also have these, it's not just the movements of migratory birds, but also local residents. I mean, localized migration of inter-island movements of resident birds. Are they either post-breeding dispersal, or they are driven off because of resource availability, or storms may be thrown off, like pitas. You'll find them suddenly in isolated islands and islets. Ang ginagawa nila doon? Of course, there's no food, they'll die. Then sometimes they'll be thrown off, like yung mga barred rails will get into a small island, and then they'll survive, so they get established. So it's swept in and out. But then you have these, even mga tree sparrows, they survive in these small islands. Quickly, I'll go through the spread of diseases. Yung spread of human habitation encourages spread of non-native species, invasive species, impact these fragile island ecosystems from rat infestations, or they may provide disease, or some of these species introduced may have overlaps with existing species. And then we tie in more of the human-wildlife conflicts might impact, so may non-target species. Yung magko-control ka pero ang tinatamaan mo would be the non-target species like endemics. And then a risk from zoonosis. So climate events may help increase stress, reduce fitness, and thus have the risk from disease. There are a lot of these human-bird interactions increasing now in trade, hunting. They provide exposure, not only to humans, but also between birds and humans. So you have avian influenza, parrot fever, psittacosis, whether it affects you direct or indirect. For a time, we were swept because we had no records of avian influenza for the longest time, because we were an archipelagic country. Yung karamihan ng mundo mayroon ng avian influenza, but for the longest time tayo wala. Of course, it eventually came. So a lot of these can be attached to extreme hunting and poverty issues, because hunting for game meat and poaching for prey is profitable, but it's not profitable to the people who trap them. It's always a low price for trappers. It's always an increasing price for the middlemen and those that sell them more. So unfair. Droughts and extreme weather may affect food availability. So birds may be drawn to food in traps. So that helps. These extreme changes in climate may impact the issue of poaching and hunting. So birds are still popular as alternative approach, especially if you are impoverished. So what needs to be done about climate resiliency? Conduct more research, monitoring studies. There's a lot of these established plots, long-term monitoring plots. We have to understand time constraint. Hindi pwedeng 1 year study, 2 years. You have to look at it at a wider spectrum of time. Annual census sites for migrants and waterways. So one of these amazing studies was done in Tubataha Reef National Park. The census starts from 1981 up to last year, 2025. So you can actually see the data for up to 2013 here on the paper by Jensen and Song in 2016 on population changes. So maganda sanang study yan. There's also studies that are being done on comparative pre and post calamity service. I remember somebody posting by Phil Bio who did work on Negros before and after the storm. We also want to look into nest studies. So there's a lot of these ano ba yung limitations of nest or importance of cavity characteristics in certain birds. So there are studies by University of the Philippines because they have this cavity nesting project. And there's also one we studied with hornbills. Ano ba yung requirement nila in terms of tree cavities? And can we augment them with artificial trees or nesting sites? So here is sort of that. We wanted to emphasize that we do have some data that allows the need for comparative temporal studies. So before Typhoon Odette hit the Siargaos, particularly in Del Carmen, we were able to do a study for Del Carmen mangrove forest ecosystems, which is studied by UST through Dr. Moran, but it was a collaborative project with UPLB, National Museum, and FRDI. So marami po kami together, there's a lot of people in that poster. So we did the biodiversity semester before, and you see the picture there of the amazing forest that they had. Here is part of Sugba Lagoon, and you can see how amazing that canopy is in terms of forest on karst limestone. So this is before Typhoon Odette. Then, of course, Typhoon Odette happened in December 2021. You can see here the before and after aftermath of the typhoon through satellite. I've taken it from Racine in 2022. So they did actually 2 days after the landfall. You can see the loss of greenery. And that can be seen after. So we also went there immediately after and saw the impacts on the habitat. So this is the forest around Siargao in Del Carmen. And we had the survey kind of post after the same study that we did with NRCP, now calling it Project Biomes, Biodiversity Assessment Monitoring of Mangrove Exits in Del Carmen. So timing then made pre and post impact of this typhoon. And this is the ones you can see in Sugba Lagoon. So yun, bagsag-bagsag po yung mga puno. But interesting that even though you see that devastation, there's resiliency in the birds. So again, that before and after study of UST and the biomes, when Typhoon Odette, noted little change in the bird diversity and richness. Of course, yes, may impacts into feeding trees and husingness, mas mababa po yung numbers, but there is that persistence of keystone species. We're still seeing hornbills, and we're still seeing, so yung important mangrove-associated birds would be able to survive. So that kind of puts in something about resiliency. But that's why we need to conduct more. So what needs to be done? Conduct more animal bird surveys across the archipelago. Look into migration flyways, of course, migratory birds as good bioindicators. We need to monitor mangroves and seabirds on islands. We can use modern techniques nowadays, of course, like Tubata started using telemetry. This is an example of telemetry on hornbills. Have to do a lot more interventions. Maybe it's time to start putting, di ba nga sa Western world, naglalagay sila ng nest box. Nagbibigay sila ng feeders. But it might be time for us to do the same thing of adding artificial nest for cavity nesters, helping reduce the impacts of invasive species, and providing more strict sanctuary, especially on islands. And we need to do more conservation education, starting young with our students from K to 12, so we're using STEM as a basis, a bit more in mainstream or social media, and of course the importance of citizen science and how you can contribute to providing. So a lot of these censuses are done by volunteers. what also needs to be done is poverty reduction. I always say that ecotourism is a driving force, but of course, if there's no one doing the tourism, they need, wala masyadong revenue. So we also need to convert people to eco wardens, protecting the forest, and some of them may be helping count. And of course, we also need to produce souvenirs. So yes, they need to be sustainably resourced natural souvenirs, keychains. So with that, I think it is important to have a very progressive and resilient Philippines, sustained by science and technology, maybe ornithological, and we also have to imbibe our values, especially our heritage values, whether it's bird related or not. And with that, I'd like to thank again the opportunity to share with you these ideas, and happy Love Hornbill Day. So maraming salamat po to Future Earth Philippines, National Scientist Dr. Lourdes Cruz, the Doble, and of course the people behind FEP's SDG Action Hour webinar. Salamat po ulit.
Yan, thank you so much. Nako, Dr. Gonzales, but I really call him a JC, no? Alam mo, JC, meron tayong mga meron ditong interesting questions for you, no? I will read it for you, so sagutin mo na lang, this question is from Mr. Leo Hernandez. Major reasons for bird migratory is abundance of food and weather. Ang question is, are our sanctuary areas affected by climate changes?
Oh yes, definitely. So may mga floodplains tayo. So nga, floodplains are important. That's the reason why they're called floodplains. So that's where extreme rainfall occurs. So that creates wetlands. And these wetlands provide food for a lot of migratory species. Di ba timing nga na dumatating October, ang wintering season is October to March. So that's also our wet season. But extreme rainfall, di ba, nagkakosya ng dredging, so nawawala yung, nababago yung mga either ma-expose yung food or makakover yung food. So it's either or, but still doesn't impact. Kasi nga, of course, waders and shorebirds and water birds, some of them like waterfowl, okay, siguro kasi they can swim above, whether malalim, But say egrets, hindi naman ganun kahaba yung legs niya. So pag masyado nang malalim yung wetland, then they won't be able to feed on those areas. So meron talaga dapat balance. And I think the habitat in itself allows that balance as long as we don't change and convert too much of the natural ecosystem. Of course, a lot of birds are even able to adapt to man-made ecosystems. Like rice fields, diba? Meron tayong mga ibon that you find in rice na nakikinabang sa mga inararo na mga paddies. But of course, we need to have a balance. Yes, they are affected in terms of climate impacts.
So JC, kasi sa Pampanga, I know, maraming areas doon na flooded, no?
Yes.
So may effect din pala 'yon, no?
Well, it's actually good for waterfowls. So, dumadami yung mga wild duck kasi medyo malalim. But of course,
pero pag malalim na
sobra naman malalim, hindi na pa kasi like yung dabbling ducks. So kahit nakalutang sila, so inaabot nila yung, kinakain nila yung mga dabbling, they feed on vegetation na natumutubo sa ilalim. So inaabot nila yon. So kailangan nila lang lumangoy pababa. So that's a bit more taxing for them.
Yes,
so I think the availability of food may be limited. So maganda talaga na mas natural yung ipapol na meron kang balance.
Okay, so ganito, kasi maraming questions sa Q&A, para meron din tayo ditong questions sa ating mga panelists. So gagawin nating alternate, no? There's a question, nakataas ang kamay ni CM Gonzalo Serapica. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Gonzales, for the nice presentation. One of the efforts that I've been trying to promote is, of course, expanding the marine protected areas, no? Including mangrove areas. Actually, we have one directly in front of the beach house at Matabungkay, and I've never heard of the bird sanctuary being included in the application for MPSAs. So I know mangrove rehabilitation, as Jardine Primavera, which is a member of NASA, has been promoting quite a bit of that. But is there a effort to combine the two? Say, if you wanted to apply, say, in a mangrove forest in Batangas, and these are the inhabitants, how do you kind of fortify the application so that you're more likely. I still remember National Scientist Alcala wishing that there's a Department of Fisheries to accelerate marine protected areas, which is one of his main activity when he was in CHED and in the ENR. And clearly, how do we connect what you are learning or reinforce our need for more marine protected areas, and how to incorporate them, your knowledge in birds? I saw quite a bit of Siargao inhabitants, which is now encouraging me. We're trying to help a school there for my foundation before, but I've never kind of associated. I thought it was mangroves, I thought it was surfing, but really the bird sanctuary in Siargao might be as part of the effort with the mayor. Mayor Del Coro is one of our main proponents there as well for both education and sustainability and climate change resiliency. So I just want you to be part of that whole conversation now that I met you. And clearly, of course, CP David is in the NR, and I've always quizzed him ever since we were part of a group called Iris to be able to promote more of these protected areas. So has there been, I think there was a question there, has there been a marine protected area or a bird sanctuary protected area like Buswanga for high animals? It would be nice to use it as a model moving forward for indeed some of the people in the private sector with landed capabilities to protect your sanctuaries. Thank you. I hope you got the gist of the question.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
To answer your question, so yes, we do have a lot of these avenues for protecting mangroves. Of course, importante po yung wider, like yung so that's Del Carmen mangrove. So we were very, very delighted and lucky that it was accepted as a Ramsar site. So part of that survey that we did initially was help provide the baseline data important for establishing it as a Ramsar site. So so that would be helping in increasing protections for areas like mangroves. But of course, locally may mga ordinances naman tayo to establish local conservation areas. I think that would be an initial step if hindi masyado pumalaki yung area na kailangan protect. So this is one thing important kasi meron tayong different avenues. So whether it's established as a protected, I could have to go through the NIPAS law, pero marine protected areas, pwede naman po siyang establish locally through the LGU or siguro a certain NGO can help in promoting the protection of that area. Of course, pag protect malaki po yung coverage, di ba? It's not just the shallow areas where birds are concerned, but also up to coral reefs, and so I think that's more because it is interrelated. Ang maganda din po lang magandang emphasis is yung pag-establish po ng more mangrove. Yes, we need more mangroves, pero hindi po na kailangan ikalat. Especially there's 2 points. One is monoculture. There has to be diversity. Lahat po ng mangroves na mas maraming ibon are not just Rhizopora. There's a mixture of different species of mangroves. And also what we call mangrove associates. So these vines and other trees that provide the food, because hindi po naman lahat ng mangroves can provide fruit and insects to a lot. So dun nagkakaroon ng limitation. So yung monoculture is not good. So maganda po talaga na may diversity of species. Another is yung providing yung mud flats. Kasi dun po dumadami so you have waders and shorebirds that come in. So pag masyado pong malalim, wala pupunta po na shorebirds. Puro kingfisher nga lang talaga makikita mo kasi medyo malalim yung tubig. So that's why it's not good to. There also is a connection between seagrass beds and mudflats and mangroves. So wag po sana magpa-plant on existing seagrass kasi mapapawasan naman po yung seagrass beds natin kasi part din po siya nung system. So you have to plant in areas that are suited for mangroves. Siguro yung alam natin na natanggal yung mangrove, then you put it back. But not to spread more and cover areas like yung seagrass beds and coralline areas na also important for other species.
Oh, thank you CM Serafico for your question, no. Napakahalaga din pala nung tamang pagtatanim Oo, no? Anyway, another question from the Q&A box. Congratulations, Doc JC Gonzalez, for your very interesting presentation. I am just curious now, how does delayed migration schedules of migratory birds affect our local ecosystems? And what are its short and long-term impacts?
Okay, so meron pong ang timing. Although I don't think there's major changes in the timing, but I think most of the people who do the annual counts, mas mapapansin po nila yan kasi sila po yung usually they do the census. So kakatapos nga lang po, I think a month ago, yung annual wetland census for water birds. That's amazing. So I think there's still regularity. I mean, the climate events hasn't really shifted that much in terms of schedules. But yeah, some people would note, oh, parang wala pa sila ganyan. Wala pa, di pa dumadating. So of course, a lot of these birds are large flocks and they may have interactions with other organisms in the ecosystem. For example, mudflat. So they help control too much worms, too much clams, too much, diba? So they feed on them as specialist feeders. Of course, ang galing ng wetlands kasi ay nung mga iba-ibang klaseng waders and shorebirds. Each of them has a specific role. Iba-iba yung tuka, iba-iba yung shape ng tuka. So iba-iba diversity ng tuka also means diversity of organisms that they feed on. And that helps control kasi kailangan talaga may balance. Hindi pwedeng mag-over ng ganitong species o mag-over na ito. So you have to have that balance. And then these important linkages, these ecosystem services are needed to keep and maintain a natural ecosystem. So kung ma-delay sila o hindi sila dumating, wala sila, then magkakaroon ng overshoot of certain organisms. Diba? Parang nga yung mga insect swarms. Pag walang dumating na insectivores to feed on the insect swarms, dadami yung insect swarms. Lalong magsaswarm. So, diba, we don't like that. Especially kung yung insect swarm na yun are pest-related. So, sabi nga nila kung walang bee-eater, so sobrang dami yung bees. But also, yes, galit yung mga apiculturists na bee-eaters, but there's also wild bees that needs to be controlled. Especially mga hindi naman nagpo-produce ng, I don't know if they all produce honey, but yeah, there's some other species of bees and wasps that are controlled naturally by these bee eaters.
Oh, wow. Ngayon ko lang nalaman na yung shape pala ng kanilang bill ay nagdedepende kung anong klaseng organism.
Yes po. So merong the curved, may recurve pa yan. Meron namang straight. Tapos meron nga yung iba ang weird.
Style lang ng bill nila yun. Yung pala may kinalalaman din sa kanilang no?
May spatula, may spoon bill.
Oo, yes. Ito namang question from Mr. Carlo Felix.
Sir, po yata.
Okay. Sige, ang tawag dito, alternate, no? Sige, academician na maala, go ahead po. I-unmute mo ang iyong mic. Naka-mute pa siya eh. I-unmute pa ni sir ang kanyang mic. Sige. Sige sir, habang hinahanap mo pa yung ayun.
Ito na.
Okay, sige.
Hi sir.
Hello, Dr. Gonzalez. How are you?
Kumusta po?
My first question is that regarding itong mga migratory birds, mayroon bang possibility na tumira na yung mga iba dito, hindi na alis?
Sir, wala silang visa.
May possibility ba kaya na
Ay, naku, yes sir, may ang ganda po ng question. So tawag po na si ma'am do sa visa. So may mga ibon po amazing that they migrate to the Philippines and come back, and of course they move across. Like yung isa, yung willow warbler, nagagaling pa ng Alaska, pero tatawid siya, cross ng Siberia, bababa ng Japan, pupunta ng Pilipinas. Tapos pagkadating ng March, balik na naman siya uli doon, akit na naman siya. Walang visa, walang passport.
Biyahero.
Pamasahe, lipad lang talaga. So of course they have to feed on all these insects to fuel their flight. So ecosystem services din. But yes, meron po mga ibon na nag-overwinter. We call them overwintering. So pagdating po ng March, hindi umuwi. Usually mga bata po sila. Kasi di ba, hindi naman the urge to go back north is to breed.
Kasi parang yung mga bata rin natin dito, JC.
Ako, medyo napasarap mag-Boracay, hindi na umaalis. Ayan. So, they come here because it's winter up there, malamig, wala silang makain. the food is very scarce. So there's a lot of competition for the scarce food. So they come to tropical areas like the Philippines to winter. So they're called wintering birds.
Pero
So,
bumabalik din sila, hindi katulad ng question ni Academician Maala na dito na talaga sila magsisettle. Wala namang ganun.
Kailangan po nilang bumalik to breed kasi andun po yung
yung breeding season.
Hindi nga ancestral breed. They have this urge to go back to their ancestral
Otherwise,
areas.
may extinct
And doon po sila nangingitlog. And of course, dahil spring na and summer, the food is available. And then, come winter, bababa na naman sila
dito.
But of course, if you're young and there's no urge to breed, parang okay na ako dito sa tropics, medyo may naiiwan. Kaya minsan may nakikita ka mga migratory birds even during the summer season dito. Dito na namin overwintering.
Wala bang nagiging kapartner ang mga
oversummering?
Wala ba nagiging kapartner ang mga migratory birds dito sa ating mga endemic birds?
So endemic, of course, are species that are only unique to
dito. Pero yung mga migratory, hindi sila na pwedeng walang crossbreeding.
Ay, wala naman po. Although we don't have, I don't want to say no, hybridization does occur in nature. So,
kasi baka yun ang rason kung ba't hindi na sila babalik Di ba, Academician Maala? What is your second question, sir?
Okay, sir, yung second question ko ay regarding rampant use of pesticides, insecticides, or what. Ano kaya yung impact nito sa birds population natin?
Yan po, yes, true. There's a lot of studies outside. I'm not familiar if alam ko meron siguro nag-aaral sa atin with those impact. Pero sana po na mas nare-report. I'm not really familiar how much kung may local effects. But there certainly is. We just don't have the data. Mas kilala po natin yung data outside. Like yung nangyari po dun sa itlog ng mga raptors like peregrine falcon sa DDT. So kaya di pa po na medyo nabawas na yung DDT-based pesticides kasi they were known to cause impacts on eggshells. Lumalambot po yung itlog. So of course, pagkaupo, basag. So pag na-incubate, patay agad yung itlog. So that happens, especially with a lot of raptors and keystone species like bald eagles and peregrine falcon. So doon po sila yung naging parang poster child for DDT. Kasi nga biglang kumonte. So that kind of, dahil may natutunan tayo sa kanila, so I think we carried it on of being aware of what is good and bad as a pesticide. But in general, we shouldn't be using because it should be enough natural insectivores and natural pesticides. I don't think I'm going to be sure that's true because I'm not an agriculturist. So, syempre meron niya na may talagang balance. But for some who does organic farming, yun, maganda na to invite and make their farms alluring or to encourage insectivores to help them fight pests.
Ayan. Sige, ang dami-dami na napupuno na tayo ng questions, So, bilisan na lang natin because we only have 8 minutes left, no? So, alternate nga, sabi ni Mr. Carlo Felix, what projects on bird research or conservation can benefit from support from private individuals?
Ooh, that's a good question. Of course, there was a lot of studies before that that are funded by NGOs. So, in a way, that's private. Of course, importante pa din ang government funding. Salamat po DOST for funding a lot of projects that concern biodiversity and even birds. Hopefully, you continue to do that. And from private, meron po kasi mga foundations that would provide that. I remember kami po nakagawa po kami ng projects that were supported by zoo grants. So meron po silang mga, especially mga zoo associations. So from their earnings, they also provide funds for conservation. Of course, a lot of NGOs. But I think, yes, from private individuals, why not? Ako po, minsan, I have
Siguro, Dr. Gonzales, if you can share your email address with Mr. Felix, siguro later on, you can also give him a list of the researches na maaari nilang maging basis for future research, no?
Yes po. So there's a lot of possibilities po.
Yes.
Marami po estudyante naghahanap ng funding ngayon. So, ngayon po, ang mga estudyante ko natuto mag-crowdfunding. So, if you have time, go to my website, to my Facebook. I'll repost po ang mga
Okay, back natin
request sa
natin yan sa
estudyante ko.
dapat ilagay natin sa chat box ang iyong
Apo.
website. Okay, thank you. Alternate nga, sige, Sir Ike, mabilisan na tanong. Go ahead po. Sir Ike Sanyeres?
Doc, sino ba talaga ang in charge sa proteksyon ng mga ibon? Sino ba talaga sa DNR? BMB ba? Mukhang napakalaki ng challenge at daming gagawin.
Yes, po.
Isa lang ang gumagawa. Sino po ba?
Oo nga.
Magandang question din po. Lahat po tayo ay involved dapat. So, it is part of our natural heritage, especially the endemic species, but also migratory birds are important to our part of our natural heritage. So, kailangan po natin silang protektahan.
Pero mayroon bang isang agency, Sir JC, na talagang ibon lang ang tinitingnan nila?
Wala pa po at the moment na tayo.
Sige.
Di po
Yan ang susunod mong project, JC.
Ako, meron po kasi sa Japan po yung Yamashina Institute.
Exactly. Dapat meron din dito sa Pilipinas, di ba?
Okay. So, meron po talaga mga
biglang nawala si Ayun, Sir Ike. Okay na po ba?
Yeah.
Okay.
Follow up lang. Follow up.
Sige po.
Kasi medyo napapaboran yung marine mga sanctuary. Ngayon ko lang narinig sa iyo. Malaki pala ito, grabe pala ito.
Grabe.
And yung isang nagtanong kanina, I think it's si MC Rapica. Magandang i-promote din natin ang bird sanctuaries, no?
Yes.
I recall Ayala Alabang has been declared as a bird sanctuary. Okay. I think UP Diliman also.
Meron bang tatlong
bang standard dyan, Doc? Para yung mga pwedeng mag-apply kahit mga villages.
I think it's more about them establishing it as a sanctuary themselves as their policy. Siguro kailangan lang siya ng a blessing of the DNR or the LGU that's responsible for it. But yeah, I mean, a sanctuary has to have certain guidelines then. So I think meron pong guidelines yan under the DNR. Parang yung mga bird watching guidelines, meron po tayong set of guidelines na dapat sinusunod.
Pero tama
I think, yes, BNR would have, especially sa under BMB po, Biodiversity Management Bureau.
Dapat si Sir Aika na dapat talaga pagtuunan siya ng pansin. So, hindi lang siya under sa, let's say, DNR or baka kailangan magkaroon talaga ng separate na, agency na yan lang talaga yung titingnan, no?
Yes, Mami agencies kasi it varies across, depending din po sa region.
Tama.
So like sa Palawan, it's PCSD. Of course, meron po meron ng sa Bangsamoro po, pero establishing din po sila kanina. So meron po din by regions, but of course, DNR would be more nationwide. But it's not just DNR's concern. Ang birds, DOT, because of promoting bird watching. DOST, because of promoting research. So lahat po I think all branches of government should be
nagka-cut across sila.
Cut across them. It's all integrative and collaborative.
Okay. Ang dami pang tanong, pero I would suggest, Dr. JC Gonzalez, can you just write your email address dun sa chat box so they can see, no? Babasahin ko din yung ibang question. We still have 3 minutes kung kaya pang sagutin. From anonymous attendee, what science-based and humane urban management strategies can cities or municipalities implement to reduce conflicts caused by barn swallows, nesting or perching on electrical wires, particularly issues affecting pedestrians, motorists? Mukhang malaking question to at mahaba ang tanong, ang kasagutan. Maybe you can just sa whoever this attendee is, pakibigay mo siguro ang email address mo kay Dr. Gonzalez, so Dr. Gonzalez can respond to your question. Thank you.
And studies din po kami sa barn swallows. Yes, importante po siya. But seasonal naman po. Pero ang pinakamalaki po dyan ay Zamboanga City. They have the largest colony.
Okay. Para mas marami kang sagot na makuha, siguro ibigay mo yung email address mo kay Dr. JC. Okay. And then from John Arquiliano, good afternoon, Doc. Lang, sana di po ba usually ang Brahminite kites?
Oo.
are commonly seen as 1 to 2 or sometimes 3 to 5 nibbles lang po. During our sampling po kasi we observe around 20 kites hovering over blah blah blah. Nababasa mo ba yan, Sir JC? Normal lang, ha? Hindi.
Madami na sila.
Okay. So, normal lang po ba yung ganitong behavior or does this indicate something ecological po like food concentration or some kind of interaction happening in the area, ganyan. I suggest, Sir John, ibigay mo din sa chat box ang iyong email address for Sir Dr. Gonzales to respond. Yes. Okay. And I think, naku, dami pa, Good thing daw ba yung may... Oo.
Makisigit lang ako kay Sir, curious lang ako. Sir, ano po nangyari doon sa Philippine Eagle Sanctuary sa LB? Bakit po nawala sa Botanical Garden?
Wala, no.
Ako makakasagot lang. Pero ano po yun, I think because it was leased to DNR, and DNR is the one which manages that Raptor Center po. Parang sinasabi niyo po yung Raptor Center. So, hindi na po I think hindi ko pala kung ano yung true, for viability of maintaining it, whether it's funds or
sige pa.
Pero pwede nyo po itanong sa BMB ano po yung story kung bakit nag-pull out po sila sa Raptor Center. And binalik po nila so I think they had one Philippine Eagle surviving, binalik po nila sa Ninoy Aquino Parks and Wildlife. So nandun na po lahat yung other raptors na pinull out nila. But it was quite interesting. Ganda po din naman nung nagawa nila I want to commend them for doing that Raptor Center. Although meron nga lang silang challenges, probably that was the reason kung bakit po sila nag-pull out. But I learned a lot of people actually enjoy that area. Marami pa akong nagkahanap. Katulad yung marami akong nagtatanong, kasi na ba yung raptors? Wala na po siya. It's now...
Sir JC, please write your email address sa chat box now. Kasi ang dami pang tanong. Sige, pakilagay mo na lang yung email address mo sa chat box. Ang dami pang tanong, hindi na natin kayang sagutin. Talaga palang ang mga ibon ay talagang nalumilipad, ay gawa ng Diyos. At hindi kumukupas. Anyway, ang dami pa pong tanong pero wala na po tayong oras. I am sure na Dr. JC Gonzales, you will also give us one more parang session ng ganitong talakayan, kasi marami pang And if you have any more updates regarding sa ating mga kaibunan dito, kasi like ngayon, yung current trends, parang marami ng mga ibon na i-extinct, gusto rin naming malaman siguro in the next 20 to 30 years, ano ba yung mga endemic species natin na maaaring ma-extinct na, So, for many reasons. Pero, gusto namin magkaroon tayo ng part 2 since nakulangan tayo ng oras. And please, write your email address sa ating chat box para ito pong ating mga questions dito na hindi na isagot ay pwede po nyong itanong na lang po directly kay Dr. JC Gonzales.
I've downloaded most of them naman po. I'll try to answer them back.
Yes.
Announce ko lang po sa ating po mga estudyante na ornithology po, nakita ko po sa ating pong file. Ang email po ni Dr. ay jtgonzales@up.edu.ph.
Yon.
Sir JC, meron po kasi tayong mga estudyante ng ornithology. Nakita ko po sa ating Excel file.
Ulitin mo, Marky.
Opo, again, jtgonzales@up.edu.ph.
Yung Gonzales niya, letter Z ang dulo, letter Z, kasi Espanyol yan. So, Gonzales, okay. So, ayan. So, nako, ang kulang talaga yung oras natin. Napaka-interesting talaga at talagang makabuluhan ang ating topic for this afternoon. So, nagpapasalamat po kami sa lahat ng dumalo sa araw na ito at higit sa lahat, marami pong salamat in behalf of the Future Earth Philippines. Thank you so much, Dr. JC Gonzales. Nako, kulang ang oras but I know pagbibigyan mo kami for part 2 of this conversation. And with that, this has been your host, Dada Doble, together with Mark Flores. Marami pong salamat. And see you again next Friday. Thank you so much. Thank you, JC.
Thank
Thank
you.
you po.
Thank you ulit, JC. Maraming salamat.